morning, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about something that's happening inside our cells every single second, the sodium-potassium pump. Now, I know the name might sound a little complicated, but it's actually a very important mechanism that helps your cells do their job. But before we get into the specifics, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered how nerve cells send signals, or how muscles contract, or even how your body maintains balance and normal function? Well, the sodium-potassium pump is a key player in all of these processes. By the end of this presentation, you'll understand exactly how the sodium-potassium pump works, why it's so important, and how it helps your body function on a cellular level. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is the sodium-potassium pump? The sodium-potassium pump is a special protein found in the membrane of every cell in your body. Think of it as a tiny pump or transport system that helps move two important ions, sodium and potassium, across the cell membrane. This pump is vital because it helps maintain the balance of these ions, which is critical for normal cell function. To put it simply, the sodium-potassium pump is responsible for actively transporting sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell against their natural concentration gradients. This requires energy, and we'll get into why that is shortly. Now, why should we care about this pump? Well, the sodium-potassium pump is essential for life. It plays a role in first, maintaining the cell's resting membrane potential. Cells are like batteries, and the sodium-potassium pump helps create a charge difference across the cell membrane. This difference in charge is called the resting membrane potential, and is crucial for the cell's ability to function. Without it, the cell wouldn't be able to do many of the things it needs to do. It's also critical for processes like nerve signaling, muscle contractions, and maintaining cell volume. Now let's talk about ions. An ion is simply an atom or molecule that has gained or lost one or more electrons, giving it a charge. This means that ions can be either positively or negatively charged. Ions are positively charged ions, meaning they have lost electrons. An example is sodium ion or potassium ion. And ions, on the other hand, are negatively charged ions, meaning they have gained electrons. An example is chloride ions. Now let's talk about how the sodium-potassium pump works. It's a transport mechanism that uses energy to move ions against their concentration gradients. To understand this better, let's quickly review concentration gradients. Concentration gradient means the difference in concentration of a substance, like sodium or potassium, on either side of the membrane. For example, there's much more sodium outside the cell than inside, and more potassium inside the cell than outside. This difference in concentration creates a gradient, a sort of a hill where the ions tend to move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, trying to balance things out. The sodium-potassium pump moves ion from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, which requires energy because you're going against the natural flow. This brings us to the sodium-potassium pump and how it uses energy to move ions against their natural concentration gradients. Let's break it down into two main functions. First is the transport mechanism. The sodium-potassium pump is like a molecular gatekeeper for ions. It's a protein embedded in the membrane of the cell, and its job is to move sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane, but against their concentration gradient. Remember, the concentration gradient is like a hill that things naturally want to roll down. In the case of the pump, sodium ions wants to stay outside the cell because they're more concentrated there. And potassium ions want to stay inside the cell because they're more concentrated inside. But the sodium-potassium pump works against their natural flow and moves sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell, even though it's more difficult because the ions are already in higher concentrations in those respective locations. This active transport requires energy, and that's where ATP comes in. Moving ions against their concentration gradient takes energy, and this energy comes from ATP or adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the main energy source for most molecular processes. It's like the fuel the sodium-potassium pump needs to function. Without ATP, the pump wouldn't be able to move the ions against their gradients. The pump uses ATP in a process called ATP hydrolysis. The sodium-potassium pump works through a series of steps. Let's go through them one by one. Step 1. Binding of sodium ions. The process begins when 3 sodium ions from the inside the cell bind to specific sites on the pump protein. This is the first part of the pump's job, recognizing and grabbing the sodium ions from inside the cell. Step number 2, ATP hydrolysis and phosphorylation. Once the sodium ions are bound to the pump hydrolyzes ATP or breaks it down into ADP or adenosine diphosphate and a free phosphate group. The energy released from this process causes the pump to undergo a phosphorylation, which means the addition of phosphate group and a conformational change. This is what helps the pump do its job. Step number 3, transport of sodium ions out. Now, because of this change in shape, the pump moves the sodium ions to the outside of the cell. This is an active process, so it requires the energy from ATP. Step number 4, binding of potassium ions. After the sodium ions are ejected from the cell, the pump now has binding sites for 2 potassium ions, or K+, from the outside. The pump now undergoes another conformational change to bind the potassium ions. Step number 5, ATP release and pump reset. As the potassium ions bind to the pump, the phosphate group that was added earlier is released. This release of the phosphate group causes the pump to return to its original shape, and the potassium ions are released into the cell. Step number 6, repeating the cycle. At this point, the pump is ready to start over. It can bind to more sodium ions and repeat the process, continually moving sodium ions out and potassium ions in. This cycle happens many times per second in each cell. Let's take a moment to emphasize just how important this pump to our daily life. First is nerve impulse transmission. The sodium-potassium pump helps maintain the balance of ions needed for nerve cells to generate and transmit electrical impulses. Without this, our nerves wouldn't be able to send messages and would lose basic functions like sensation and movement. Second is muscle function. For muscles to contract and relax, they need a proper balance of ions, especially sodium and potassium. The potassium pump ensures that muscles can function effectively from voluntary movements like running to involuntary movements like the beating of your heart. And lastly, cell volume regulation. The pump helps control the movement of ions that regulate water balance in cells. If the pump wasn't functioning properly, cells could either swell up or burst or shrink and stop working altogether. To wrap up, the sodium-potassium pump may be small but incredibly powerful. It's responsible for creating the electrical gradients needed for nerve impulses, muscle contractions, and even the regulation of cell volume. By using ATP to actively transport sodium and potassium ions, it ensures that all cells can function correctly and keep us alive and healthy. Without this pump, life as we know it wouldn't be possible. So next time you move your muscles or think about something, remember that this tiny pump inside your cells is working hard to make it all happen. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next module. Bye-bye!